Siberia.
Yeah, exactly. And so what he's hoping that he can do is that he'll go all the way across Russia, which was itself, things that all scientific expeditions had done at that particular time, and hitch a ride across the Pacific to the United States. At which point he would have landed in the Pacific Northwest well before it was part of the United States. That would have been a very interesting journey. But as you know, Scott, he got as far as Lake Baikal in Siberia before the Tsar arrested him as a spy, and so he was under arrest. And because it was simply so unusual for somebody to try to do that, and much less for somebody to be blind, and there was just a huge amount of suspicion that maybe he wasn't actually blind. And in fact, there were a lot of these reports that he was acting not like what you thought a blind man should act like. That it seemed really, really suspicious. And the last thing the Tsar was going to do was let him go all the way to the Pacific Northwest, which at the time he was quietly trying to colonize in the kinds of international treaties at the time. So he was taken he was taken in the coldest of winter as a prisoner and conveyed all the way back to Moscow. And he was on a horse-drawn sleigh, and it was so incredibly cold. And the soldier that had the orders to arrest him didn't actually have orders to return him alive, and he just needed to be stopped. And so he is literally dragged back through thousands of miles of Siberian winter wasteland and nearly dying. He talks about going to a roadside tavern and doing everything he can to try to literally crawl inside the oven. And he survives that, and then he is in fact expelled from Russia as a spy. But once again, he gets the taste of what he can do, what he should do, and that only makes him try to call another circumnavigation. But once again, if he told people honestly, I'm going to try to go around the world, they would simply have him moved from a blind asylum to an insane asylum, because it just wasn't possible.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. And also at this point, he does get his critics. You would think that a blind man who had successfully traveled the world and has started publishing very successful and entertaining travel logs would be untouchable. But then there are these critics that come out of the woodwork and criticize him because of his blindness. And you would think, how could anyone do this? But can you describe the criticism he receives from other English travel writers?
Yes, this is what was very interesting, and something I don't think he was aware of, is that there was quite a market for travel books at that time, but there were also people who were becoming novelty travelers, you might say, and James Holman in Russia crossed paths with another British Navy, retired Navy officer named John Dundas Cochrane, who was trying to make a name for himself as the pedestrian traveler. And by that, he meant that he was walking his way through the countries. And that was his brand, that he was the pedestrian traveler. And it turned out he was fudging it left and right, first of all. And that he met James Holman in Moscow just when he had come back from making a supposed walking tour of Siberia. And so he went back to England and he was writing his book about the pedestrian traveler in Russia. And the last thing that he wanted was to be scooped by the blind traveler. If anything, he just thought that the blind traveler would make his achievement seem like less of an achievement. So he launched into these attacks about the blind traveler. He was doing this while James Holman was still in Russia. And he simply points out the idea that how basically on an existential basis, on an ontological basis, can a blind person truly be said to have traveled at all? You know, if he hasn't seen the place, how does he really know that he was there? How can he, you know, really say the experience is with any kind of authenticity? But basically, he was appealing to other sighted people who, you know, had a very limited experience of what being blind is like. You know, you close your eyes and you think that you don't know and you don't experience a place, right? You know, if you want to fool somebody, you know, take them to a surprise party or something like that, you close their eyes. So people imagine, well, that's true. If I went through, you know, Europe with my eyes closed, I wouldn't think that I knew what was going on. But the nature of blindness is actually far more complicated than that. And you don't know what it's like to be blind when you close your eyes any more than if you fall out of a tree, you know what it's like to fly. Mm-hmm. Very, very completely different experience. And it took me a while to understand that. I actually had to go through a training process where I had blindfolds on to actually understand how the blind interpret the world. But this pedestrian traveler guy simply pushed the right button and started criticizing the whole idea that he had any authenticity whatsoever. And basically just implied, well, he could be so easily fooled, couldn't he? And there was no evidence that he was ever wrong. There's really literally no facts that seemed to be that seemed to be incorrect, or much less made up. It was a seed of doubt for people. And so when he came back to England that particular time, and that was his second great group of travel, he started getting criticized. And most importantly, he started getting dismissed more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think some of the criticism, as you said, they would claim, well, you can't experience it when you're blind. But then there was a strange tautology that people would use, saying that, well, what he did couldn't be that remarkable because if a blind man can do it, then by its very nature, it can't be that difficult to accomplish because a blind man could not accomplish anything so difficult. So it's a tautology that it's foolish, but it seems to work with people. And so at this point, is this at the stage in his life where his travels start to come to an end and then he's working on his biography, or does that come later?
Oh, no, it's time for a second attempt. This time basically what happens is that he decides he is going to circumnavigate the globe. But once again, if he announced that he was doing it, it would not be acceptable. So instead of saying that he's going to circumnavigate the globe, he announces that he wants to help this eccentric friend of his fight the slave trade off of the African coast, which basically would involve intercepting the slave trader ships when they're on the open sea and taking them and taking the human cargo and repatriating them back to Africa. But what's interesting is that he gets permission to do this precisely because nobody thought that it led to anywhere, because it seemed to be the most remote place possible. But secondly is that he said that he was doing it for reasons of his health, even though it turned out that this ended up being the most malaria-infested spot on the planet. And the vast majority of the people on the expedition ended up dying of malaria. I think it was something like a 70% mortality rate. But he managed to sell it as such. The other thing is that nobody expected him to be traveling beyond it, because at this point, let's remember, he still had lifelong crippling rheumatoid arthritis. And at the point that he goes on this trip, he can't even walk. He cannot stand up straight. When he gets on the ship that carries him to Africa, he literally has to be carried on board. So there was nobody who thought that this was a person who was in any shape to complete a circumnavigation. And yet, that's exactly what he does, and he ends up basically hitchhiking off of a Dutch ship after he, does these things. He goes to Africa. He goes to South Africa. He goes to India. He goes to Australia, and basically just kind of stays a step ahead of the authorities, who at this point are onto him and are in fact trying to get him to come back. But he does in fact do it and achieves his circumnavigation. But then it is time for him to come home, because he still has those duties waiting him of attending prayers twice a day. By now, George III has passed away, and now Queen Victoria is in charge of the empire. So it's slightly of a different Windsor Castle that he returns to, but the fact remains that he is now in his 40s, I believe, late 40s, early 50s, and is expected once again to go nowhere at all. And that becomes the setting for the final act, the final struggle in his life, because he's not done with his travels.
One other fact of his life I'd love you to touch on, and I think this is in his second set of travels, but he had certain methods to prove to people that he wasn't helpless. And I think on ships, when he boarded, he'd quickly scramble up to the crow's nest to show that he knew what he was doing. Do I have that right?
Yes. That's actually, that was one of his tricks. He loved going on ships for two reasons. One, because as a former naval lieutenant, he was in fact quite familiar with ships and could speak on a level of equality with the officers, with all of the naval workers on board ship. And the other factor is that ships are very circumscribed worlds where things don't change; they're all in a particular place. And the whole idea also that the whole idea of one hand for the ship and one hand for yourself. That almost every place had a walkway and something where you're supposed to hang on to, you're supposed to touch, so on and so forth. So being on board a ship is a very tactile experience at that time. So he was able to make people forget that he was blind, because all of the tactile handpoints, where the handrail was, where these rope, the mainsail rope was, that sort of thing, was very easily processed by him. And he would push that, because he would actually do what's called skylarking, is that he would climb up to the very, very top of the mast, which is quite a feat. And people usually is something that young midshipmen would do. And he would be in his 30s, 40s, 50s, and just happily climbing up there and basically being the king of the world. So that was a cool thing.
Yeah, I mean, I hear those things, I wonder, why isn't there a movie about him? I don't know if you're at liberty to say, but was your book ever optioned?
Yes, there have been several attempts to produce the movie version of this. There are several challenges, and I actually am still confident that at some point there will be a movie version. But there are a few things to understand. Two things that Hollywood is very wary of is A, period pieces, and B, stories that require a lot of locations. So this is a case where we have a long period of time to go through 70 some odd years. So you would have to start with the Napoleonic era, a transport on that you would end in the mid-Victorian era. The clothing, the costume changes on that, but then also the idea of shooting, not necessarily having to go around the world to these places, but still having to shoot, to create sets that are meaningful, passable in all these different countries, all these different time frames. So what I've been told by multiple producers is that it can happen simply because the core role of James Holman would be an amazing role for some major actor, because it would be such a vehicle, I guess would be the word for that. But until the right person comes along with sufficient clout, it can't be like a little small indie sort of thing. At least that's what I've been told.
Okay, well,